Welcome to the While You Wait podcast. We work to bring you stories of humanity, care, and hope from across the Arkansas healthcare landscape, all while you wait to start your day. Our series is hosted by the staff at the Arkansas Behavioral Health Integration Network, a local nonprofit dedicated to better health for all through integration. On today's episode, we continue our deep dive into the world of education, examining the evolving role of teachers, shifts in the educational landscape, and new insights from emerging research. Last time we heard from Stacy Pendergrast, AFMC's Teacher Support Program Lead, who brought a powerful dual lens as both a former teacher and a current education specialist. Today we're honored to be joined by Dr. Anna Odell, an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Arkansas Little Rock, and lead researcher on a recent study exploring teacher resiliency. Her perspective brings fresh depth to the conversation, and we're excited to hear what she has to share. We'll get to that in just a moment, but we are a new podcast, so please remember to subscribe and share wherever you get your podcasts. Also, feel free to drop us a note at www.abhinetwork.org for any feedback, questions, or episode suggestions. With that, let's get started on the episode. Welcome back to the While You Wait podcast. I'm so excited you're here. I am your host, Caitlin Johnson, and it's just me today. Misty Trent, my other co-host, is not able to join me today, so I will be doing this unsupervised, and we'll see how that goes. I'm joined this morning by Dr. Anna Odell with the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Dr. Odell, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about teachers' well-being and finding ways to support them and their students as well.
Yeah, I was very, when I heard your presentation at the NASW conference this year, I just was, with a lot of the other projects that ABIN is doing, it aligned really well. And it was really interesting to hear things from the teacher's perspective and just the well-being around the conversation about well-being with that. So before we get started, though, I'd love for our listeners to know a little bit about you. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So like you said, I work at UA Little Rock in the School of Social Work. I'm an assistant professor, so I just moved to Arkansas last summer and am enjoying this heat. My education is all in social work. So I started with getting my bachelor's in social work up in Indiana at a smaller school, and I grew up in Indiana. And so I wanted a little bit different cultural experience for my master's. So after I'd worked for 8 or 9 months as a kind of skills coach for students in schools and helping with a community mental health organization, I decided I was going to move to Mississippi and go to University of Southern Miss and got my MSW there. I got to get some research experience there. I worked as a graduate assistant on some different tasks. So kind of piqued my interest in research and really kind of built on what I had been seeing as a kind of caseworker in the schools, seeing what teachers were going through and how they wanted to help students. While also just sometimes not knowing or having enough energy for themselves to be able to engage emotionally with students in that way and not knowing how with like the skills. And so I was like, interesting. I feel like we could make more of a difference as social workers / community mental health providers if we could help just train teachers to do a little bit of that work as well. And so then I got my master's and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And so I worked as a school-based therapist for a couple of years. I worked in Mississippi in a K through 3rd grade school. Nice. And then I moved back to Indiana and worked there for a year in an outpatient, ironically not the same office, but the same company, community mental health company. And so I worked as a therapist, so I did outpatient work as well as in the schools. And I kept seeing the same thing. It'd been a few years. I was like, teachers are still needing help. They need support. And so that really kind of helped with that research part. I was like, how can I help? And I hadn't been seeing much in the research about teacher well-being in terms of teachers as whole people. And so then COVID hit, and it is pretty difficult to do therapy over video with, 8 and 9 and 7-year-olds who are like, I'm going to ride my bike and I'm going to take you with me. And I was like, actually, Wi-Fi doesn't work that way or something, or you kind of get left in a laundry basket for a second or whatever, they get distracted. So, and I was like excited to go do my research. And so I moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, and started my PhD in 2020 in the fall, and really focused on teacher well-being and retention, and really wanting to figure out how to support teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And then UA Little Rock hired me, and so here I am. That's my kind of educational professional journey. Uh,
Well, welcome to Arkansas. You're right. It's extremely hot here, especially coming from. I mean, I think I have a couple of friends in Indiana, so I know it still gets pretty hot up there,
it
but
does.
a little
Not
bit.
as humid
I was going to
usually.
say not as humid, right?
It's true, but it is less humid than the Mississippi coast, so I will say that.
I believe that. I believe that. So just kind of listening to your story, yeah. Did you think that you would always work? I mean, like, was kids where you set out to work with in your career, and teachers, or did you have like a different interest and just kind of fell into it, which
Yeah.
happens a lot with people in our profession? So just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably by my own sort of track record with education, I really love learning and love education. So I think that, or I believe that schools are a really integral piece
Mm,
for
yeah.
helping get any type of preventative or intervention work, both for students and their families. They're like community hubs. And so for me, it was like, how can we make this kind of a one-stop shop where students and their families can get help or can find referrals or places where they can branch out from the school to get help.
Mhm.
And so I think, with having to attend school and all of those things, requirements for students, why are we not just kind of morphing that? And so for me, I always loved working with kids. I was a camp counselor for several summers, and loved just like I was in church a lot, and working with kids, and did a lot of children's ministry stuff.
Mhm.
Kids are just funny, and they keep you on your toes. And I think so much, again, preventative work and intervention work, in especially the elementary age, where is kind of where my heart is, can help kind of diffuse some of the later things in middle and high schoolers. And so for me, it's kind of focusing on that area. And just elementary teachers just kind of have a different gig than
Yeah.
middle and high school teachers as well. Kind of the setup with being in the classroom with the same students all day, pretty much all day long, and having different kind of tasks and responsibilities and roles in the school, where they're kind of pulled from, hey, sorry, we need someone to cover lunch duty, or we need someone to cover recess, or something along those lines, which can be a little different when the students are older,
Yeah.
and don't need as much kind of individualized supervision, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I ended up. I didn't know what I wanted to do after my master's, and I was kind of like, I guess I'll do therapy. And so I kind of just did that, and it worked. And I learned a lot and really enjoyed it. I miss it sometimes, but yeah, that's kind of where I went.
So you said when you were explaining kind of how you got into working, I'm going to call it pediatrics because I'm a medical social worker at heart, but
Oh, you're fine.
pediatrics and with kids,
Yeah.
you mentioned preventative care. This is
Mhm.
really is preventative care. We know, especially as social workers and therapists and all of that, being educated on the brain, we know that a lot of the needs that we see as adults formed in childhood, depending on what we were exposed to, what we weren't exposed to, and things like that. So
Absolutely.
I really appreciate that take of preventative care, because with ABIN, in doing integrated behavioral health and primary care, we really view that as preventative care as well, right? So if
Mhm.
we can prevent this from exacerbating, if we can prevent this depression and anxiety and this grief and insomnia from turning into something even more severe, and then you needing a higher level of care, let's do
Mhm.
it, right? So it's nice to know that people are working on the other side of the continuum with us, and we're kind of like trying to meet in the middle, right? So one's working with
Yeah.
kids being preventative, and we're working with adults trying to be preventative in
Mhm.
that aspect. So
Yeah, every level is so important. But just some ways that kids' brains are just growing so rapidly. If we can just integrate some of those mental and behavioral health and social emotional learning skills and those kinds of trainings early on, it'll come back around. So,
right. Right. And I'm curious, with Euler being my alma mater, I'm curious on what classes are you teaching? What do you teach at Euler?
yeah, I teach human behavior in the social environment.
Well, this
So,
checks then, right? Huh?
human development course. So I teach that for the undergrad students. I am the course lead on that. So I design the course for all the adjuncts that work under me for any of the course sections. But Yeah, that's what I teach. This summer I've been teaching social work practice in schools, an intro to social work. So a graduate level course, and then an undergrad kind of open to whoever. So, but mostly just human behavior in the social environment, which pretty much fits with everything.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say that. What a great person to have teaching that. I
Yeah.
loved Hipsy. It was so much fun because you got. It was really, I guess, for me in that graduate program was one of my first introductions to like brain development and why we act the
Mm-hmm.
way that we do. Because in undergrad, it's not clinical, so it really was like kind of my
Yeah.
first interaction to or introduction to that. So I'm really interested in your perspective. I know you're probably asked this a lot about before COVID and after COVID. And I was going to be like,
Yeah.
oh, see. And I'm like, no, I shouldn't say that. So before COVID, you were doing some school based work. Um,
Yeah.
and I imagine that after COVID, even though it sounds like you went, right after COVID into your PhD program, were you able
Mm-hmm.
to see a difference in the classroom between those two, kind of before COVID and after COVID situations?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk. Not as familiar with like the research side of things necessarily, but I mean that kind of comes into play when you talk about looking at stress and when teachers, when I was in my PhD program as well, and having that be like a specific contextual factor.
Yeah.
But I think from what I've read, what I've seen, what I've heard, prior to, we're still, I mean, we've been having issues retaining teachers for decades. I mean, that's been in the research within the first 5 years. That's typically when you lose the teachers the most, like if that makes sense. So retention is that kind of that 5 year mark. If you make it through that 5 years, you tend to like go farther. But pretty much 5 years is kind of like within the first 5 years, teachers are more likely to leave. Um, so looking at that, I mean, are we? I've been thinking about like, are we trying to just pour more water in a bucket that has holes that we're not fixing, and trying versus like retaining kind of that quality teachers? But teachers had to deal with so much change, and we know that stress often gets exacerbated by change,
Mm-hmm.
especially that rapid change and so significant amount of changes. So both with students and with teachers, trying to change their modality, trying to make sure that students are getting to learn what they want, because teachers are so dedicated to their students. Like this is why they do what they do,
Right.
and worried about their students' well-being. On top of that, as well as trying to keep themselves well and teaching remotely. And so, just knowing that their dedication and passion in the classroom, and trying to translate that remotely. And then they didn't come back into school, and I started in the fall. So I never really saw the classroom after that. But I know when we got the email in March where it was like, this is happening, we're going to be shut down for a while.
Yeah.
I was in my offices in the kindergarten hallway, and I think they pushed all the kindergarteners into one classroom, and they're like watching this movie. And all the teachers were like kind of standing in the hallway and working on stuff. And I was like, how's it going? What's going on? And they were like, yeah, we're trying to put together these care packages for students so that they have crayons and scissors and glue when they go home, so that they can do these activities when they go home, because we don't know when we're coming back. And so there's this just like thought of wanting to help their students even be prepared to do anything, whatever is happening, and continue with their skills, and all of their learning. And so I'm not sure, kind of what happened, but hearing from other teachers and the difficulties of trying to adjust to that, and feeling confident that that self-efficacy piece kind of comes in, and being confident in your teaching when you're doing that remotely and can't measure or know if the student's even there or doing the work, or if parents are, you never know what's going on behind the camera. You want to assume the best, but and knowing that, in terms of numbers, a lot of teachers just decided to retire or leave the profession. It was too stressful. And so it's not just that we were losing teachers before, or we weren't losing teachers before. There was retention issues. That has always been the case. But it seems like COVID sort of magnified the issue and then kind of accelerated it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it's much more on the forefront, and we've kind of been in this shortage crisis for a while. And those ESSER funds kind of helped after with COVID, but those come to an end, right? So some school districts have prepared well financially to kind of continue those programs, and some have not. And so we're going to see that, and have seen that kind of unfolding as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you say, just for clarification, when you say teacher retention within the first 5 years, are you saying retention at
Yeah.
particular schools, or are they, kind of bounce around a lot, or are they leaving the profession after?
I believe it's leaving the profession,
Wow.
and not just jumping around schools. But that's Dr. Ingersoll, who's out of, I think it's University of Pennsylvania, put out that study, and I can try to find that for you. But I think it's 5 years they'll leave the profession,
Yeah.
which has kind of been burned into my brain for a while, and not just moving schools or districts, actually completely exiting the profession. So
I think you're right. I mean, I think teaching, very similar to social work or anything in mental health, you really have to have like that passion behind it.
mhm.
Because the going gets tough a lot. Like you're going to hear a whole lot of really scary things sometimes, or really hard things to hear, especially from your students. And when it's kids, it adds like another layer of just like sympathy and empathy on top of it. So the feelings are really,
Sure.
really there. So you're pointing out like these teachers were trying to find ways to send these kids home with the things that they needed, and
Yeah.
then these teachers trying to learn how to instruct over video, but also how to mitigate some of the home lives of these students,
Mhm.
because we all know that some of these students go home and it's not the best or most conducive learning environment for them, and that they come to
Mhm.
school for a little bit of a reprieve, right? So that
Mhm.
managing the biopsychosocial part of this really amped up during COVID, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And, schools are often really helpful for students getting meals as well. So you
Yeah.
think you bring in that kind of biological piece too, where it's like, are they getting fed at home? How are they, what kind of monitoring and supervision are they having? Student or parents have to work still. Like there's all that stuff. And so, it all comes into play for sure.
Right, right. I know there's, a school that we work with over in East Arkansas. One of the site coordinators was telling us that one of the students was chronically truant and would come in
Mhm.
late all the time. And finally, the site
Yeah.
coordinator, which is, I'd compare it to like a case manager in the school, someone that's there
Mhm.
really as a resource to help the students achieve graduation and their goals and that. They finally got a referral over to the site coordinator. And after having a conversation with this student, it was brought up that he's responsible for several of his younger siblings and getting
Yeah.
them dressed and on the bus and to school, or if they're still doing some kind of virtual learning, set up. And
Absolutely.
he didn't have a phone or an alarm clock to wake him up on time.
Right.
So they problem solved, got him an alarm clock, and now he's able to get to school a lot sooner, even
Yeah,
though he is taken care of. Sometimes family dynamics require that, especially if the
for
parents are
sure.
working, 12-hour shifts and et cetera and all that. So I
Yeah.
think we can't put it into a box of like, oh, this student is just not interested in learning, or the student
Mhm.
is non-adherent to the teaching plan. There's a lot of things
Mhm.
going on at home, and I think when we don't recognize that these kids are humans in their home environment, then we run into a lot of issues right in the classroom.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Yeah, and that, I mean, you can expand that to teachers as well. I mean,
oh
they
yeah,
had their own kids at home
exactly.
trying to like figure that out while doing their job, while having administrators that also are like, what do we do? Like, how do we do this? And so the same, yeah, exact same idea. It's like, how can we find these resources and these strengths to help students succeed? Like finding an alarm clock, sometimes so small,
Yeah.
but we can miss that as practitioners sometimes. And I feel like social work has a good training to be able to kind of notice those details.
Mhm.
But helping teachers sometimes even just recognize, hey, maybe just think about like if there's other tools that could be used, even something as small as just tapping the desk for a student or putting a hand on their shoulder if they, you can
Right.
sense that.
Mhm.
It's just small things that could diffuse things before they, kind of blow up into a bigger situation. But understanding that for teachers as well, they're dealing with all their own stuff and wanting to be like, hey, you're human beings too, and you can't just like it's not necessarily healthy to completely separate your professional and personal life.
Because it's just not doable, right? Like it's just
It's
right,
literally
sustainable.
impossible, or I'd have serious questions, I guess, about what's going on there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So you mentioned talking about teachers' stress level and their own things that are going on, and then having to come in and manage,
Yeah,
many kids. I would say many kids in a classroom because I know these
many.
classroom sizes are growing even and bigger, especially as
Hmm.
restructuring and redistricting is going on. And that I
Yeah,
know some of your research touches just briefly on the physiological connection between our students and our teachers.
hmm,
And that there might be a connection between like a shared cortisol level. Do you mind sharing a little
yeah.
bit of that, like what cortisol is and how it plays into our brain, and maybe what you've seen in some studies as far as the connection between them?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, when I read that study the first time, I think it was from 2016 or 2017. I was like, "Holy cow, this is incredible!" I'm not a medical professional, but the cortisol levels. So cortisol is a stress hormone that everyone has in their bodies, and of course, like before we kind of jump into stress, stress is a not necessarily a negative thing. It's something that pushes us to do things. That it gives us places to grow,
Good point.
and a lot of times having levels of certain levels of stress are healthy for us because it pushes. Like we have deadlines at work, and that's how we get paid. Like things like that.
Yeah.
But of course, stress can grow into something that can negatively affect us as well,
Hmm.
especially if we have difficulty with stress management or coping.
Hmm.
So cortisol is kind of responsible for that in our bodies, and that's the hormone that happens. And so this one study in particular was looking at elementary age students and teachers, and found that teachers had higher cortisol rates in the mornings, I believe, and that was correlated with students having a little bit higher cortisol rates as well.
Hmm.
And so looking at that connection, not necessarily the cause, but that there's a connection there. That if you have heightened emotions and stress, students will feed on that, right? Like not intentionally, but just like the vibes of the room, so to speak.
Yeah.
You kind of have that emotional energy,
Hmm.
and that can happen. So if you have kids of your own, or if you've ever been like with clients or something in a situation, and you're kind of keyed up or anxious or maybe stressed about something, that can often come across kind of that relational bridge, and affect the other person, or they might be like, hey, what's going on? And students don't necessarily have that language, especially younger students. And so being able to teach them how to do that and be aware of that is important. And sometimes you'll have students, when they start recognizing it in you and telling you, hey, you seem like you're feeling this way, like maybe try a
Yeah.
deep breath or something, right? So like, that's, kind of the goal. But so in terms of cortisol levels, that one study I read was really impactful and just always makes me remember like how I'm feeling is affecting the people around me, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's intentional or not. And so what I can control is kind of how I manage that,
Right.
and
Right.
what that looks like. And so I think that was just a really cool study to be like, okay, what does that look like? Because how we're feeling impacts our actions. And so students may not be aware of that. And teachers with higher stress levels and cortisol levels, we know that stress, if that level is higher, can often impede our performance.
Is there like a social learning aspect of this? Like, is it good for teachers to kind of show how they regulate themselves? Like, how does that benefit in the classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. Modeling is the way that a big way that students learn, right? So, like, think about students watching their peers to figure out how they act in situations or if they're okay or whatever it is. They're watching adults in their lives. So, they're important adults. Typically, it's like teachers, family, like your parents, older siblings. And then also just like maybe some community members, or like if you go to church or something along those lines, you're going to have like adults in that section where students they want to please adults. It's developmentally appropriate, and they watch you because they've been on Earth for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, and they're still figuring out how do I navigate this section, all of these life things, and then how do I handle my emotions around that, right? So, and sometimes, as we know as practitioners, we have to resolve our own kind of childhood things emotionally, so that we don't get triggered by other people's stuff,
Yeah.
and having that reaction. And so sometimes, in terms of what you're saying with the kind of social learning aspect, is being able to model how to appropriately manage your emotions, is really important, especially if there's stuff that happens in the classroom. and just a caveat that everyone interprets stress a little bit differently and has a different kind of resilience level as well. So something that might bother you may not bother someone else as much, or maybe having a deadline is a little different. Like I've had friends that are very much procrastinators to get things done, which stresses me out, and I would much rather be more prepared and have it done far ahead of time.
Yeah.
So there's different levels in that as well. And so there's different factors that come into play, which can make it tricky. But if we know how we're feeling and how to manage how we're feeling, and we're able to kind of demonstrate that, then students can kind of take that. They're smart. They know that you're stressed. They know that you're mad or frustrated. Like they know what's going on. So having those important adults being emotionally healthy is important in that kind of modeling and piece, as well as just recognizing that something's happened. So like sometimes different family functioning can be like we just pretend it didn't happen and just move on, but that's not resolved.
Yeah.
And kiddos hold that, right? Like they hold that emotion because they're like, I still don't feel good about it, but we're just gonna not like pretend it's not there, or go do whatever. Right. And so sometimes it's just having teachers address it and be like, wow, that was a lot. Is everyone okay? Maybe we should do some deep breathing or something along those lines as a class, or even just saying it on you. We're saying like, wow, that made me feel, or I felt, using I statements, I felt worried during that time when the student was like, I don't know, I've had students where I've had to go help out when they're like throwing chairs and stuff. And that's more of a kind of more extreme behavioral thing. Or there's an argument where students are getting really into it in the classroom or something, just being, working on using those I feel statements, like I felt worried about this, or I felt like stressed or frustrated at what was happening because I couldn't focus on my work or whatever it is. But walking students through like, I feel this way because of the situation, and not necessarily looking at that kind of negative emotion, so to speak. Like emotions aren't negative, but taking them more neutral. And kind of walking through that as a teacher and being like, oh wow, like yeah, I think I felt that too. What could we maybe do to help us get back to a place where we can focus on our learning or something? Or what could we do to like welcome those students back into the classroom when they come back, or something along those lines? And taking that 5 to 10, maybe 15 minutes could, of course, impede some of your teaching time, but having emotionally regulated students are going to learn better.
Right.
So is it worth that 5 to 10 minutes where you're not necessarily keeping up on your schedule? And I think that's something I had to learn as a therapist as well. Like sometimes, and as a teacher, as a professor now in class, like sometimes things just go differently and you have to adjust. And that's part of that flexibility and resilience piece, and that stress management where it's like, I don't have to stick. It's flexible thinking. I don't have to stick to this particular script all the time. I can adjust based on the emotional needs of my students and also myself.
Yeah.
Because as an adult, we learn how to get over stuff or push it away, and students don't necessarily know how to separate that. And so everyone's going to be in a better state of learning if they're able to see how you regulate your emotions.
And decrease that stigma, right? Like when you were explaining kind of the teacher taking a second and just saying, wow, that was a big thing that's happened. What can we do? Calm down. Maybe we should do some deep breathing. I think some of it takes the tabooness of it out, or the stigma of it out, to know like, oh, even Miss Smith feels this way, that it must be normal to feel this way, or this may be okay for me to talk about. So I think there's a couple of different useful reasons to do that. So you mentioned resiliency, and I think that's something we should take a minute to talk about, because you're right. I agree. Seeing patients that I've seen, we talk about kind of the fuse. I talk about increasing their stress tolerance, increasing their stress fuse, so that it's not as short, and they can deal with it a little bit longer, because life happens. There's a lot of people that walk into our offices, or that have walked into our offices, where we're like, yeah, if we could resolve that situation for you, you absolutely would feel a lot better. Like, this is a situation you're dealing with that cannot change, whether it's grief or a new job or losing a job or whatever it is. So resiliency is such a key piece in that. And you mentioned that I was wondering if maybe you could share a little bit of how resiliency played into your research, how it plays into teachers' well-being, and the definition of it, if in case anybody doesn't know what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my research, specifically, when I talk about teacher well-being, most of the literature tends to look at teacher well-being from more of a professional standpoint. So how are they feeling well in their school or related to their job or in connection to student well-being, and not necessarily looking at teachers holistically. And so for me, I'm looking at what about all these other parts of their well-being? What about their own mental health and all these other things that don't necessarily always come up in like a professional way, or it's kind of filtered through a professional lens, if that makes sense. So I'm just like we talked about students as whole people,
Right.
wanting to see like teachers are also whole people and recognizing that. And so for me, looking at resilience, I really wanted to take what I call an asset-based approach or more of a strengths-based approach.
Okay.
It's kind of a similar thing. So the research is really saturated with stress studies and burnout studies. Like we know teachers are stressed and burned out. We know there's lots of different factors coming into play. I'm not seeing a lot of like, how can we look at this in a different way, and more of almost a solutions focused way where we're saying what are the strengths and the resources that teachers and schools already have and the communities around the schools already have. What's already working, how can we expand on that, and how can we use that while we're kind of building in some more long-term supports and making longer-term changes. And so for me, I was like, I know stress is important and it's a huge critical factor in looking at well-being. It affects our well-being. But how can I look at this in a different way? And resilience really popped up for me because that's the way, kind of the definition is like a teacher's ability to respond appropriately to a situation and then recover quickly from that stressful situation. And so what skills do they have to be able to do that? What is their emotional capacity for that? What are their coping skills? What are their recovery skills? Those restorative factors. And for me, that was kind of that other side to stress, right? So like, instead of focusing on, these are all the negative stressful factors happening, what are we looking at on the other side? The other side of that coin is how are they handling the stress and what does that look like, and terming that as resilience. And so that's kind of what I looked at. And so looking at that definition, what I was seeing in the literature already was that teachers with higher resilience levels, which are often higher or improved because of emotion regulation skills and self-reflection and stress management, will have more of an emotional capacity to respond to students. You're going to handle stress better. You'll likely do more or better problem solving with conflicts and other things, and just have more, maybe even more like energy during the day, if that makes sense, like mental energy and stuff. And so that just can look really different. But that also depends, like I said, teachers are individual people. So that depends on their own background and experience, their emotional intelligence and emotional regulation levels, those kinds of things, as well as school climate comes into play and administration. So there's like lots of systems things that come into play. As social workers, we talk about that ecological systems theory all the time in person and environment. And so making sure that we're looking at teachers and their environments and understanding the impact of all those factors coming into play, just like we look at students with their mental and behavioral health issues too.
Right. And I think, kind of like what we talked about before we jumped on here is, we're learning that all of these boxes belong together. Like they're not as siloed out, right? So having the conversation of a teacher, who they are in the classroom, and then who they are in, civilian world, in their own personal life, those two are intertwined. Not that they're taking their personal life and bringing it into the classroom, but there are, just like you're saying, just like our students, we recognize there are things going on in their personal home life that will affect them in the classroom. Absolutely. Yeah. It's the same thing here. And if emotional regulation isn't isn't something a teacher has access to, maybe to learn about, or maybe to practice, then it can follow them into the classroom and make it difficult for them to foster that resiliency that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, finding those kind of professional developments. I know it's kind of leading into sort of some of the other parts of what I'll talk about later, but finding those professional developments and trainings that can focus on that as well for teachers.
Are there any examples of how a resilient teacher might model some of these coping skills or emotional regulation for their students, just if anyone's listening and looking for some tips?
Yeah, for sure. I can share from my personal experience and something that I use in my personal life and my professional life. So I think social emotional learning is like the key to everything. Not everything, but it's super important, right? So, because how we feel impacts how we think about ourselves, about other people, about how we interpret situations, and then also what our actions are after that, and how we respond. And so this is specifically working with elementary students in terms of the professional kind of examples. And so it might look different, applied differently with middle or high school students. So it would just look a little bit different. So in terms of social emotional learning, my favorite curriculum to use is called The Zones of Regulation by Leah Coopers. They have since updated the book a couple of times, but I think it's still it might be under $100. When I got it, it was. I don't know if it still is. It comes with how to do stuff and explain everything, and then also comes with, when I got it, it had a flash drive, and then it was a CD, or like a CD and then a flash drive. So now it might be just a digital download, but it has a bunch of activities and things, and they've also done some school-wide adaptation parts as well. So like you can do this at a school level. So starting individually, this curriculum really helps students recognize their feelings and communicate them, and kind of understand how your emotions impact behaviors and choices of yourself. And then you can expand that into building empathy for others and recognizing how your behaviors and emotions, I kind of call it pushing people into other zones, so to speak.
Nice.
And so there's 4 different zones, and you have blue, green, yellow, and red. And green is kind of the ideal zone. A lot of students start calling it the good zone at the beginning until they help them reframe that, like, being in any zone isn't bad. It's just how you're feeling and how you handle it, and what you do with those emotions or because of those emotions is kind of where it necessarily gets into unexpected or expected behaviors versus like good or bad and kind of moralizing behaviors, because that's kind of how the system is in schools, right? So like it's good or it's bad, it's kind of black and white, and trying to help them expand that thinking. So you have like it's like energy level, low is the blue level and higher is the red level, and then there's just different emotions in each section. So students can identify how they're feeling by a color, and you can kind of understand how they're doing, or they can there's different words in each one, and they can identify how it is. I made posters and had emoji faces with the word, and we would go through it, and they could understand that a little bit. That took a lot of time and had to have a giant laminator and stuff. So sometimes that's not necessarily feasible, but maybe at some point getting to that. And so we did zone check-ins every time they came in. And then eventually sometimes they ask you what yours is. So you have an opportunity to model that for them. You could do it as like a personal journaling activity that they hand into you at the beginning of class, any of those things. But it's all about being able to recognize how they're feeling, put a word to it,
right,
and then figure out how can I regulate to a place. And I always talk about framing it in terms of how can you do your job? What's your job at school? And when students are at school, their job is to get their work done and like follow directions, those kinds of things. And so, so being in the green zone, ready to learn, ready to listen, focused, like happy, all those things, that's helpful if they're there, but not all students are there all the time. And so just helping them figure out how can you get to a point where maybe you're still in the yellow zone and you feel frustrated or worried, or maybe you're still in the red zone, you feel really angry at this other student, but you're able to regulate enough to get back to, I can focus on my work and do my job at school. And so I think teachers being able to model that with students, and just, I mean, it took probably 6 months of meeting with students and doing this that they start to get excited about doing the check-ins, and they learn enough that they want to ask you where you are, and sharing maybe why you're in that zone. I never force students to share. It's important to give them that autonomy, as well as kiddos typically don't have a lot of choice or autonomy. And so being able to give them some of that can help build their confidence and their kind of feeling of safety. And then just knowing that being in more than one zone at once is okay, feeling multiple things is okay, but how can we still like focus and do our job? So I had a little kiddo, and he was in first grade, and he had been diagnosed with ADHD, and so he got on medication after trying a couple of other things. And so he would come in and do his zone check-in. He'd say, well, I'm in the green zone, I'm focused, but my body feels like it's in the red zone and has high energy. So it's like this way of communicating He's like, I can still do my work, but like my body still wants to like run around.
Yeah.
So it's able to give them kind of a language to communicate with you. And so sometimes, that could be the case. Just like sometimes my body feels in the blue zone, I feel really tired, but I feel focused and like I need to work, right? So I love using the zones of regulation. It's easy, it's colors and words, and students pick up on it really quickly. And I think using it, as a teacher would be really helpful. And you can do lots of different, they have toolboxes, which are like your coping skills. There's lots of great like metaphors to use. And stop, slow, and go thinking is like a traffic signal. So decision making, all of those really important skills for life in general. So that's kind of what I do. I also use the zones when I was with roommates. I would ask them what zone they're in, and we did zone check-in. Like things like you can use it at home. You can encourage parents to adapt that at home. I would have them do like make their own zone posters as students and take it home and try to do that with their families, because if they can teach it, that means they've learned it, right? So trying to encourage that. I also use it with my students in undergrad. We do zone check-ins. We do like a kind of emotional check-in every time we meet for class. But I do introduce the zones and then repeat those a couple of times during the semester so that they can learn how to do that. So yeah.
I love the one. Yeah. While you're explaining that, I'm like, oh, I probably need to look at that for myself. So I know how to regulate. Which anyone listening, I mean, you got a bunch of therapists on here talking about how it's hard to regulate themselves. So, I mean, just to give you an insight on how it can be difficult even for those that are trained to do it. So this is a normal problem to have. A couple of things that I heard, you mentioned, one of them is like consistency, like making sure you're consistent. Kids need that anyways, but I mean, as adults, we need it too. We know what to expect. So doing it, like you said, it could take 6 months for someone to catch on to those things, but they do catch on, right? So that consistency. And then one of the other things I was thinking too was, as the teacher or as the admin or whoever is showing the students this tool, it's also showing the teacher how to do that check-in in the morning. So they're like the setup for the day is a little bit more predictable for them, in the sense of you don't have to play detective and figure out what's going on with Johnny and Sam and Susie all at the same time. When they come into the room, they're able to point out a picture, or they're able to say, I'm this color, and it sets you up in a way that's easier to regulate yourself. So you're regulating your environment too, right? Did you see any of that?
Yeah. So it's being able to, like you said, set up and you don't get that unexpected behavior, which tends to be what pushes us into our yellow zone or red zone, right? And so if you're able to be prepared and teach students how to, then that reactivity can be less. And I had less time to be able to work on that with teachers. So it was mainly student-based and then sometimes family-based. But a lot of that was individual, and I would love to be able to see what it looks like implemented on a school-wide level, but didn't have a chance to do that yet. So I'm excited, hopefully in planning in my research and kind of how I want this to morph, really wanting to help with just something easy to implement, and really you could do it with, administration could do it with their teachers too. It feels silly doing it with adults, but it really does pay off in the end.
It's a common language. Like, we're all speaking the same language in the room, but like emotionally we're not. So learning how to talk about it together. So, those are really interesting examples there. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that we talked about was, with resiliency, you found that there was a correlation between resiliency and well-being with teachers, but there wasn't necessarily a correlation between self-efficacy, and that maybe that didn't play out the way that you thought it would in your study, which I'm doing research from that point of view. It's like, well, I might have been wrong. Why was it?
So that's fair. We have hypotheses, and we think, based on literature and research, we're like, this is likely the case, but if it's not, why? Like, what does this look like? So always keeping that kind of attitude of curiosity. So in terms of, so self-efficacy was this other part of what I was like, I think well-being is affected by self-efficacy. And if you're not familiar with self-efficacy, teacher self-efficacy is specifically defined in 3 parts. So it's how confident teachers feel in their ability to manage classroom behavior, to impact student learning or engagement in learning, and then also to instruct students effectively. So it's kind of these three pieces. And the literature was kind of showing there is some overlap. Sometimes it's not using, kind of speaking the same language, right? It doesn't always use the word well-being or resilience, but these all like it quacks like a duck kind of situation. And so connecting those pieces. And so in my study, I found that according to my sample, which tended to be teachers that are in secondary schools or high schools was the majority, and they had at least like 15 years experience, I think was like the largest. So that is another kind of variable to consider when you're looking at why is self-efficacy? Well, they're probably, there's some, I have ideas, but so self-efficacy wasn't shown to be a significant predictor of well-being. They are correlated, like they have a relationship. But it wasn't a significant predictor, although it did have, the surprising part was self-efficacy and resilience as well. Both had a positive relationship with teachers' intentions to leave, which sounds kind of weird. So when we talk in research, a positive relationship means that both levels are increasing. So self-efficacy is increasing and teachers' intentions to leave are increasing. That's what a positive relationship means. When we talk about negative relationships, it means that one is decreasing while the other is increasing. So typically, like teacher well-being increasing means has a negative relationship, which means their intentions to leave are decreasing, which is what we want, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's weird to find this teacher self-efficacy and resilience levels related to specifically just intentions to leave were both, they were positive. So that means higher levels of self-efficacy and resilience in teachers meant they had a higher intention to leave. And it was significant. It was a small effect, but it was significant. And I was like, what is happening here? So it's really interesting to unpack that. And so I have some theories, some ideas, but of course that would have to be explored maybe in more like interviews or something along those lines. But that one is like, oh, I'm not, like you said, am I wrong? What's going on? But kind of just like this is a weird curveball that I have to figure out what's going on here, and being able to explore that in the future. But in terms of my sample being teachers that are in high schools and have much more teaching experience, they might know their worth and how they want to be treated, or they move or leave positions or leave the profession because they're like, I can go make money. I have experience, like significant experience, or I can just switch around, something along those lines. Or I deserve to be paid more, and I know that I have these skills that I can translate into this job, or something along those lines. And definitely other things that could happen, but being confident and able to handle things and being like, hey, like things aren't changing here, so I'm just gonna go do something else. And so that was just an interesting kind of what we call a direct effect, where those two variables were specifically related to teachers' intention to leave. But I was pretty surprised that self-efficacy wasn't significantly predicting teacher well-being, although in the research it does show that. So it could be my sample size, could be the way, kind of what that, or the makeup of my sample and what that looks like. But
was your, and just for curiosity, your sample, was that Arkansas based?
It was not. It was a national.
Oh, really? Okay. So yeah. Big old. Okay. Yeah. And when I was listening to your presentation, looking at the graph that you had up there, the effect you intended happened, because I was also surprised at the answer for that.
For sure.
But I'm glad you said what you did as far as like self-efficacy. I know it's not necessarily the same thing, but I think of it as advocacy almost for yourself too, is like, okay, do I, like you're saying, is I have a little bit more confidence. I kind of know what I want out of this profession, or I know what I want for my administration or pay, or specifically what I want to do. So that increasing the possibility of a teacher leaving makes sense with the way that you explain it. Is like, okay, the more confidence they have, the more that they're able to say, okay, I think I want this out of this. And if I'm not able to get it from this environment, maybe I need to find a different environment. Right. That makes sense. So it sounds like self-efficacy, while it didn't pan out like you expected in your study, it still has a really important role in the classroom. So I'm wondering, how might a teacher's confidence or level of self-efficacy, or lack thereof, affect the approach to helping their students manage their own stress, or, navigate those learning barriers?
Yeah, for sure. So I think hopefully you've picked up on that this is all reciprocal relationship, right? So like teachers affect students and students affect teachers. Like it's both things. And so, if a teacher has higher self-efficacy in like classroom management and that piece, when we're talking about those three pieces, it may allow them to feel more confident in handling like a conflict between two students or a group of students.
Yeah.
And then that is going to, or behavioral issues, I guess, with students. And that's going to reinforce their confidence to be able to do it again, right? So it's kind of like this cycle, and then also affects, so students are able to see, oh, this is how you would, again, social learning, this is how you would handle this kind of conflict or something, and this is how you would resolve it. And that's that, and this is how it works. It's not always that clean, obviously, but just kind of boiling it down. It also happens in other areas, so maybe students learn more or differently, or better, I guess, if teachers believe that they have strong skills with engaging students, or they have really strong instructional methods and students are showing that they're learning from that. And so that reinforces that confidence of like, oh, I'm an effective teacher. I believe I can do this. And so it's kind of this back and forth. And sometimes it's also recognizing like, I'm really confident in this, but my students don't seem to be learning. Do I have kind of the awareness to self-reflect and say, how can I figure out how to shift it so that these students can learn? And so it's trying not to let that demolish you, because we all come in with good intentions. Like even I do as a professor, I come in, I'm like, the syllabus is perfect. They should understand it perfectly, right? And they don't, right? Or I come into a therapy session and I'm like, okay, I have this plan and they're going to understand everything. And then they bring in a curveball or something else that comes up and it's totally different, or it's not what you planned. And so being able to kind of shift and be flexible and understand that, and really have that self-awareness and self-reflection piece is really important for teachers and practitioners too. But that's going to help build that confidence as well, because you're seeing, and resilience really right there, as well, where you're saying, this is stressful for me because I thought this was going to work and it didn't, and it's kind of unexpected. How do I navigate that emotionally? How do I navigate that mentally? And then how do I translate that into helping students learn better or learn differently or adjust my approach in some way? And so does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And then like, while you're talking about that, the psychological flexibility keeps coming up, in a couple of ways that you're describing that. And, with psychological flexibility, that's kind of a personal journey, and being able to integrate that into your professional setting and into the classroom. So not all of us are born with that psychological flexibility for various reasons, right? So I'm wondering, like, as far as school admin and then just like personally, how do we foster that ability to not only feel confident in some of the things that you're doing, but also know how to ask for help or stay flexible when you need to adjust what's going on? Like, what would your suggestion be to help our teachers do that?
Sure. And just before we move into that one, this also happens if, of course, that self-awareness isn't there and there's a negative experience and you don't handle it well. Teachers, that reinforces the negative spiral that they're not, and then that decreases that confidence and self-efficacy in those areas, which can influence. So it goes both, again, another two-way street. So keeping that in mind, it can be a very positive thing, depending on your coping skills and resilience levels and that kind of stuff. It can also be either kind of a negative pit stop back onto the road, or it can be another avenue completely, right? So I like metaphors and they seem to work, but so that happens. But in terms of working on some of those resources and practicing, I know a lot of, there's been some shifts from what I've seen in kind of isolated places. I will say I spoke to someone with Little Rock School District, and they were talking about really focusing on putting like wellness rooms in schools, which is pretty cool. And that is just for, I believe it's for teachers to use to just kind of go and like chill for a second and then come back, right? So those kinds of things. It's also a lot of education, right? So it's not just, we can't just tell students, okay, use the zones of regulation and, tell me what you're feeling, right? So I think the same approach has to be for teachers as well, where it's like, let's explore kind of a balance of personal and professional. How can we explore some of the things personally that maybe emotionally you weren't aware of or connecting from your own experience, how that impacts how you're functioning professionally. And then they want to know, how do I help my students? And like that's really how you help your students, right? So, but like pulling all those pieces together in a professional development can be really, really important. And so there's a company I was working with out in Nashville, and they were working specifically with Black educators, and they did kind of a restorative training. They have this pilot study going on. It's a restorative training day for teachers, and they really focused on that emotional well-being piece and that kind of restorative practice of self-care and those kinds of things. And so even finding people that are able to lead some of those different little trainings that and then having people to be able to reinforce that learning in the classroom. I think we've all gone to conferences where we're like, I want to use all this stuff that I learned. And then you get back into your practice and you're like bombarded with everything that you are. And you're just like, I'm trying to like tread water. So I think having administration on board to be able to help like reinforce that by finding those professional developments and choosing to check in with your teachers. Are you implementing this? What does that look like? Do you need any other supports? How can I support you to implementing this so you can be more emotionally healthy in your position? Because that school climate and that admin support has been one of the biggest things identified in the research, and anecdotally and from other research hasn't been that in this Nashville study as well. Is just like having administrative and leadership support is a huge piece of teacher well-being and feeling like they can be themselves at school and emotionally like talk about stuff and be open.
Yeah, I'm thinking of again, with me being medical social work primarily, thinking from that point of view too, is like if my admin is not supportive or doesn't at least recognize the very tough situations, people are coming to us on probably their worst day, right? They're coming to the doctor's office, they're coming to the hospital on one of the worst days of their lives. And we're there to help them with that, which then, there's transference of trauma. There's all kinds of stuff that can happen with that. So if admin is not aware and supportive and providing opportunities to learn how to regulate, usually you see a lot of burnout, which I imagine transferring over. I mean, again, those students bring everything into the classroom. So these teachers are not only helping them learn things, but they're also helping them emotionally regulate the things that are going on at home. And if admin is not setting up a even playing field for that, it can be really difficult to feel confidence, right? So if my admin doesn't even feel confidence with this, confidence in me, it may be difficult to produce that myself.
And sometimes it's like mindfulness trainings or brief little things. Dr. Catherine Crisp in the School of Social Work here at UALR does some excellent mindfulness training. So even inviting people, or practitioners in the community as well to come in and say, hey, how can we work on a stress management technique and what does that look like? And just inviting them to include that as part of professional development. And then how does that work with my students, right? So like teachers want it for themselves and also for their students. And so making sure that link is really important there.
Yeah. I love the idea of bringing in some like community practitioners, because that strengthens that sense of community anyways. Like there's people out there that understand what I'm going through that aren't necessarily across the hall from me, and learning from each other. So. Again, we want to thank our guest, Dr. Odell, for the work she is doing in this space, providing education and further insight into how we support our teachers and, in turn, our students. We hope to see you back for future episodes of the While You Wait podcast. Please follow or share this episode with colleagues, friends, and family. Until next time, take care.